Welcome to this video lecture on linguistic fieldwork ethics and informed consent. The content of this lecture mainly concerns data collection in form of video and audio recordings, where research participants either provide words and sentences in their native language or tell a story in their native language. These recordings will then be used by linguists to investigate various aspects of the native language of the participant. Before going into details, I would like to say a few words about why ethics and community relations matter when doing linguistic field research. So, working with languages means working with humans, with individuals, and with a community. As in any other working relation with human subjects, respect for individuals is essential and values of communities need to be considered. So there are three principles that can be highlighted. First, the autonomy of human subjects always needs to be protected. The researcher should be honest and truthful and ask the participants for informed consent before participation in a recording session. Informed consent means that the participant who agrees to participate knows exactly what they are going to do, what it is for, and what is going to be done with the data they provide. The second point is, while it is surely important to maximize the benefits of the research project, the risks for the participants have to be minimized. This can, for example, mean that names or video, audio captures of people are not published, in case this would bear negative effects or risks for the participants. And third, all procedures should be fair, equal, and non-exploitative. This includes appropriate acknowledgement and compensation for participating in a research activity such as a recording. As many of the things discussed here are culturally dependent and may vary greatly across the world's regions, I will here focus in particular on practices which are appropriate in Indonesia and the Philippines. So in this lecture, I will discuss the following topics. First, the relation of the researcher to the language community, how to work with them, and how to select the right participants for the research goal. Second, how to gain informed consent in linguistic fieldwork. And third, how to acknowledge and compensate participants for their participation and work. Every speech community has their own unwritten rules and values. Therefore, it is important to know the cultural context of the community where you're going to collect data. If you are an outsider to the community, you want to respect the culture and make people happy rather than upset or suspicious. This can sometimes be hard due to limited time or budget. If you are an insider of a community, on the other hand, you have the advantage that you know the language, the people, and their culture. But it may also be challenging because your role will suddenly change and you will be in a more professional relation with your neighbors or family members than you would usually be. In the following, I would like to give some advice on how to find and select participants for wordlist collection, in particular, again, in the context of Indonesia and the Philippines. One aim of collecting words in form of a word list is to get an initial idea of a newly studied language its vocabulary and phonology. Another aim is to obtain data which is comparable across languages. Lists of meanings or concepts which hold corresponding words in several different languages can function for synchronic and diachronic comparisons across languages. To collect such a word list, the researcher needs preferably more than one participant. Ideal is a group of 3 or 4 native speakers of the language the researcher wants to study. The reason for working with a group here is to stimulate discussion and consensus about the right word for a certain context and meaning. The participants in such a group can be of any age. However, in some communities, elderly speakers might recall more words than younger speakers. This holds in particular for communities which are bilingual or undergoing language shift or language endangerment. In general, local authorities such as village heads, teachers, or religious leaders can usually give good advice on who to work with as a language consultant. In general, if time permits, don't select participants at the first day, but take some time to get to know people, their relations, and positions in the community. Now let's turn in more detail to the topic of informed consent. Informed consent can be either gained in written form or orally. Written consent is usually obtained by signing a consent form in a language the participant understands fully. The form contains all points in relation to the research which the participant can agree to or not agree to. The form also contains fields where the participant fills in his or her name and possibly other personal data. Finally, the form needs to be signed with date and signature by the participant. Note that for underage participants, a parent or legal guardian needs to sign. Oral consent should contain the same information as the written consent form. It can be obtained in a dialogue with the researcher, which is documented by a recording, preferably in audio and video format. Also, the written consent procedure should be recorded, if possible. This would be for better documentation. In such a recording, the researcher explains the content of the form and asks the participant to read it out, or if he or she is comfortable doing so. The process of signing the form will then also be videotaped. So now let's turn to which information a consent form should always contain. First, the goals of the research project need to be explained in a way a layperson and non-researcher can understand it. Second, it must contain the willingness to participate and the permission to use the data from the speaker. It needs to be made clear here who will have access to the data, if it will be publicly available or not, if it can be viewed or also copied, downloaded by other people. Here as well, it is important to use formulations which are easily understandable to non-researchers. Permission for participation and data usage can be formulated in positive statements, such as the following. I feel good about talking about my language with you, and I know and understand that what I say can be recorded and other people may listen or watch it. If I want, I can say to you, don't show to other people what I told you. If I want to, I can say to you, don't use my name. I can stop teaching you about my language anytime. And so on. Further aspects to consider are the following. It's important to stress that consent can also be only given to part of the aspects in the consent form. So it is possible that a participant agrees to participate, but he or she wants to remain anonymous. In addition, the researcher should make clear that the participant is free to withdraw the consent at any time, also for only parts of the recordings, for example. This is an important aspect because a participant may say something on a recording which they later regret or don't want other community members to hear. Think of conversation topics such as gossiping, for example. Finally, when should consent be obtained? Consent should be obtained before the first recording session with a new participant. The consent does not have to be renewed for further sessions unless the contents and the research project goals and data usage plans changed. As the consent procedure is preferably recorded, it can be part of the first recording, and which is made with the participant. In certain circumstances, it might not be possible to conduct the whole consent procedure before the recording, the first recording with the participant. Then this can be, as an exception, be done directly after. However, the participant always needs to know that they are recorded and have to agree to it. Finally, a very important point is how to acknowledge or compensate participants in a research project. First of all, participants, speaker of the language community you are working with, should always be acknowledged in papers and publications based on the data collected in the community. This can be done by mentioning their names and acknowledging them in a footnote of a paper or in the introduction to a book. If they agree with that, otherwise it can be done anonymously. In case of longer and more intense collaborations, publishing co-authored publications with community members, such as dictionaries, for example, are a good way of acknowledgement and cooperation. Furthermore, participants who spend time working with the researcher have to be compensated for their time and their work. This is not only ethical, but will also ensure a more reliable working relation, which can last longer. However, it very much depends on the local circumstances if payment in money is an appropriate way of compensation. In many cultures, payment in kind is also an appropriate way of compensation. In Indonesia or the Philippines, it is suggested to pay participants per half days of work in the equivalent to a primary school teacher. So this can be done by dividing the monthly teacher's salary by 20 working days, then again dividing it by 2, and so getting an amount for a half day of work. However, if a participant only helps out once, not on a regular basis, tells a story, for example, it may be rather appropriate to compensate with gifts, such as souvenirs from the home country of the researcher, or fruits and other special delicacy from a local market. In general, it is advisable not to pay people in front of others, as this might be embarrassing for everyone present. One may also insert cash into an envelope and hand this over to the participant together with a small gift. So, to sum up, linguistic research participants are part of a language community with their own cultural values and norms, which the researcher needs to be aware of. Participants must give their informed consent before participating in a study. And finally, they need to be compensated for their work in an appropriate way. Keeping ethical issues in mind when doing linguistic fieldwork is not only a necessary requirement, but will also ensure better relations with the speakers and thus give better results for the research project. The content of this lecture was inspired and taken from a chapter on ethical field research in Claire Bowen's Linguistic Fieldwork, a Practical Guide, published by Palgrave Macmillan in 2008, and as also materials from the Language Documentation Training Center of the University of Hawaii at Manoa. Thank you very much for listening and see you in the next lecture.